National Taxpayers Union. Thank you for coming to our panel where we're talking about the very sexy issue of internet taxation. You saw that the title of our panel was "You're Doing It Wrong," how not to tax internet sales. And I wanted to start this by asking for a show of hands. How many of you have in the last, say, year or so purchased something online? I guess a better question is, has anybody not done that? And the answer is no. How many of you reported a use tax on your income tax return form for the things that you purchased online? All right, we got one person. Bravo. We have one person who knows that, technically speaking, when you purchase something online, because most places like Amazon don't have a physical presence in most states and are not required to collect that state's sales tax. But when that happens, you are technically required to report a use tax that is usually the same rate. And so as you can see, there's an issue here that we have this arena of internet sales that have sort of effectively operated outside the realm of taxation, which that might make some of us who are more libertarian than others happy. But who it doesn't make happy are the brick and mortar retailers, the Walmarts of the world, the Best Buys of the world. And those folks have been on the warpath in recent years to try to force states their sales tax burdens onto all internet sales. And so we're trying to sort of illuminate that issue a little bit here today, to talk about the background there, why we are where we are today, and talk about maybe how we can fix that without destroying a lot of the Supreme Court precedent, without destroying some of the good protections for taxpayers and for consumers, to make sure that we're not imposing huge burdens on retail sales on the internet, which is obviously an increasingly important part of commerce as we move forward. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists, and we're going to, hopefully we'll have sort of a free-flowing discussion here. If you guys have questions that you want to sort of clarify things in the middle of it, feel free to shoot your hand up and we can try and answer, and we'll also do a Q&A session sort of at the end. So with that, I want to turn it over to Joe Henchman from the Tax Foundation. The Tax Foundation is a great organization in DC that focuses on the sort of nitty-gritty of tax policy. And Joe knows this issue inside and out, so he can kind of give you a little bit of the background for why we are where we are today. Joe.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to some materials in the back, so feel free to pick up on your way out. Well, knowing the name of this panel, this question should be easy for them to ask anyways. Who knows what the following states have in common? Alaska, Delaware, Montana, New Hampshire, and Oregon.
No sales tax.
No sales tax. Citizens of these states have decided to do without one of the major taxes. They do it in different ways. New Hampshire does it with a reduced size and scope of their state government and the services that the government provides. Oregon does it with higher taxes on other things like income. And different states will do that different ways. And that's the beauty of federalism in the 50 states. Different states can have different taxes, different levels of services, different opportunities, and compete for all of us. And we get to choose what's best for us as individuals. Now there's one group of people, there's one group that hates the fact that there are states that have no sales tax. And that's states with a sales tax. What I would call competition, they call loopholes. So every state that has a sales tax has also adopted a use tax, which is, and as Andrew described, a tax on any item that has been purchased tax-free. So take me for instance, I live in Virginia. If I travel up to Delaware, Delaware being one of those states without a sales tax, and I buy some shoes tax-free there, and I bring them back to Virginia, under Virginia law, I owe Virginia a 5% tax on those shoes. Virginia is asserting that it can tax a transaction between me in Delaware and a Delaware retailer. That's the use tax. And as I said, every state with a sales tax has one. And the U.S. Supreme Court has upheld them as constitutional in a 7-2 decision. Now, as we saw earlier also, nobody pays their use tax. States don't bother to try to collect it from the people that don't pay it, because they know you would have a few words with them if they tried, and because it's expensive and costly and administratively difficult to do that. Now there is one limitation on the states in all of this. they cannot, under constitutional law, force the collection of a use tax from someone who's not in the state, who's not physically present within their jurisdiction. So if there's a retailer with all of its property and employees outside of the state, that state cannot force that retailer to collect the use tax. This is what's known as the physical presence rule, or the Quill rule, after the most recent Supreme Court case that laid that out. It's just the latest of a long line of constitutional cases that have limited state tax powers. Now why? Why does the Constitution allow Congress and the Supreme Court to prevent states from extending their tax powers beyond their borders? Well, one reason is it'd be a mess. State sales taxes are a mess. I just got the latest calculation earlier this week. There's 9,646 sales tax jurisdictions in the United States right now. That's growing at about a couple hundred a year. Each one of those has its different definitions and different rates and different rules. I work for one of the oldest tax research organizations in the country. We have trouble keeping up, and we're not trying to run our small business on the side, for instance. It's also important to know that each state taxes different things differently. So here in DC, if you go to CVS, our drugstore, and you buy a bottle of fruit juice, it's tax-free. If you buy a bottle of soda, it's taxed at 6%. If you go across to the restaurant and buy fruit juice or soda, it's taxed at 10%. It's the exact same products, but it's different in tax treatment based on when or where you buy it. In Minnesota, for instance, fur clothing is taxed differently from all other regular clothing. In New York, clothing is tax-free so long as it's less than $55. And that changes to $110 in April. There's all of these rules like this all over the country, which make it very difficult to keep up. And then on top of it, 16 states have sales tax holidays, where they change their rules completely for like a weekend or a year, temporarily. And then those change every year, what they are and where they'll be. Now, our founders, under the Articles of Confederation period, saw states tax whatever they want, wherever they want it. That's what states did. So states on the coast tax items coming in through the ports, and whenever goods travel across the state, those states would tax it, going into the interior of the country. And the experience was very bitter. Our founders saw this whole thing harm interstate commerce and damage the national economy. So they included in the Constitution a number of different provisions to prevent that and make sure it didn't happen again. The Commerce Clause, the Commerce Clause, and many others. If the states got their way, and some are trying, the so-called Amazon taxes that Kelly's going to go into, these taxes, of course, go far beyond just purchase them on Amazon.com. We face new questions. Who gets to tax an online sale? What state? Where the customer is located? Where the seller is located? Where the internet server is located, which is often a completely different state? Where the truck passes through in delivering the good? Where the warehouse is? All of them? None of them? Some of them? States do not want to resolve that issue. Every state wants to tax 100% of the transaction, and that creates a serious problem for interstate commerce if there isn't some overarching framework put on all this. Now, I do have a lot of sympathy for the brick and mortar retailers that complain about this. They say they're selling the exact same product to you and me as online companies are, and you and I have to pay the sales tax when we buy it from them, and we don't have to pay it when we buy it from online companies. And they're right, there's no economic reason why a good in one instance should be taxed and in another instance should be tax-free. But if we're going to change the system, we ought to make sure that it's something simple, something understandable, and something that's fair across the board. Whatever burdens the tax system puts on online businesses, it ought to put on brick and mortar businesses too. The states should not be allowed to collect all of this money until they accept basic rules and definitions about what gets taxed and where. There's a couple of bills before Congress, and there is one that actually goes pretty far towards resolving some of these issues. But I'd love to hear your thoughts and reaction to all this stuff. So as I said in the back, we got a USA Today article which sort of gives a good summary of the issue, some testimony we presented, and an NTU little sales tax map. You can, of course, keep up with this issue at taxfoundation.org. I'm going to turn it over to Kelly from Americans for Tax Reform, and then we'll get your questions and comments.
Before we turn it over to Kelly, just quickly to touch on what Joe was saying. So we have this situation now where the only way that a business is forced to collect a state sales tax is if they have a physical presence in that state. So obviously if you go to a Walmart in your town, it's very obvious that they have a physical presence because you just walked into it. A company like Amazon, however, has a physical presence in relatively few states. They don't have retail stores that you can walk into. There's no Amazon corner store to go to. They have some distribution centers and things like that where they have physical property, but Amazon has a physical presence in relatively few states. So Amazon only is forced to collect sales taxes for those relatively few states where they have a physical presence. And what's happening now is there's been this movement across the states to try to assert that businesses have a physical presence based on all sorts of different things. But I sort of joke that pretty soon we're going to get to the point where a business says if somebody drives through the state with a bumper sticker that says Amazon on the back, that means Amazon has a physical presence and has to collect sales taxes. So
New Jersey's been hijacking trucks at the state line.
yeah. So there's a new sort of strain of this where states are reacting to the existing law that says you cannot force anybody to collect unless they have a physical presence by trying to manipulate the definition of physical presence. So to talk about that and a lot of the other sort of related issues, Kelly Cobb from Americans for Tax Reform, another good Michigan boy like me, go blue, is going to cover a lot of that stuff, and then we can circle back after that. Kelly.
So when I think about e-commerce, I try to think about it not necessarily in the way that we normally think about taxes, which is kind of a rigid system, but as a sort of disruptive force in the normal retail marketplace, right? It's a disruptive way of changing a market. So in the same way that catalog sales really disrupted how we do business in the 40s, 50s, 60s, the internet is doing the same thing today. It creates efficiencies, it creates economies of scale, it has a number of very important business reasons as to why these businesses are becoming this way, and why e-commerce is growing so big. So with that in mind, I think a lot of this debate has to do with the business model. It's a challenge of that business model. So the traditional retail folks, the Best Buys and Targets and Walmarts of the world, I also sympathize with. It's not fair for them that they have to create, or they have to collect tax, and when you're an online seller, you don't. There's very good reason that they're upset about it. It's not a balanced marketplace in that sense. So what they've done to try to fix this problem for themselves is not try to bring the rates down to create that level playing field, but they've tried to bring the other guys up. So they tried to put the taxes on the other guys. And they've done it with a little bit of success. And they've done so mainly by challenging that business model. So the first thing that they tried to do in 2007 in the state of New York was they said, if you advertise, if you're an out-of-state company, you advertise on a website in New York, that advertisement on that website, which is typically known as a click-through ad, which you see every single time you log on to any website, you click through and it takes you to a retailer, an online retailer. That ad constitutes physical presence in the state, just like Andrew joking about the bumper sticker would. That immediately kind of got some legal challenge that has still not sorted out yet. And they've instituted that in 7 other states. And you'll see a consistent pattern as to which states they've done it: California, New York, Illinois, Connecticut. They're not exactly the freest of states. And they've instituted this law despite the fact that every single time they do it, there are enormous negative repercussions. The first thing is that the online retailer, which believes this, all online retailers, you can ask them all, they all believe this is an unconstitutional issue, tax. Yeah, and because it is. And so what they do is they sever their contract with that advertiser, that online advertiser. So now you've got, New York passes a bill, well, New York's better. Illinois passed a bill, and immediately Amazon and all the other, Overstock.com, all these online-only retailers sever their contract with these online advertisers. So one, they just put tens of thousands of their own residents out of business. Two, It did nothing to actually collect the tax because they've severed that fiscal nexus tie. You see what I'm saying? The nexus there is broken, so they actually didn't solve the problem. And three, we jokingly state that they actually probably lost tax revenue because all of these guys that closed up shop now aren't paying business taxes anymore. So, you know, a lot of these states will put out a fiscal note and say this is going to bring in $300 billion in California. And we joke that actually or $300 million, we joke that you're actually probably going to lose, you know, $15, $20 million instead. Which, hey, maybe that's a weird backwards way of saying, hey, cool, yeah, go for it, shrink government that way. But that's a very big problem. So they realized that that's not working so well. So they tried another one a couple of years ago, and it's called the reporting requirement. And they basically said if you're an online retailer, you have to put a notice on your website. If I'm in Louisiana and I buy from a guy in California, on that website in California, it has to state that you owe tax on that, and you have to remit that use tax to the Department of Revenue. Colorado did this in quite a funny way, and North Carolina tended to follow their lead. They not just said that, but they also said that the retailer, the online retailer, had to send all of your information as a customer to the Department of Revenue. Your name, your address, what you bought, maybe even the SKUs, all of that. So not only this time did they violate the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, they actually violated the First Amendment and your right to purchase things anonymously. So they doubled down on constitutional violations through attempting to collect taxes online. Ridiculous, in my personal opinion.
And in two federal judges.
And in two federal judges' opinions. In Colorado, they shot it out immediately, and another court in Washington actually shot down the North Carolina law. So that one went out. And then the conversation switched to the next part of the e-commerce business model, which is these distribution centers. So when does a distribution center constitute physical nexus? If you have two different companies, so you have to think about it, these business models that a lot of these online retailers have are, take Amazon. Amazon not just sells from their own stuff, but they'll sell, if I'm a business and I want to sell through Amazon, I can do that. So they've separated their business between their online market, their online retail market, and their shipping systems, because they're kind of two different, they see them as two different businesses. Well, that's also meant that the online retailer guy is now a separate legal entity from the distribution center that ships it, right? So even if you have a distribution center in the state, there's a very interesting and gray area, which Joe can go into better than I can, the constitutional question as to whether that distribution center actually constitutes physical nexus. So that's the third way they've tried, and that's kind of where things are right now. There's 3 federal bills introduced. We have concerns about them. I think the 2 primary things that most folks should understand is because this is a Commerce Clause issue. You know, states don't have rights to do whatever the hell they want. They have states have rights that are set in the framework of the Constitution. So interstate commerce questions like this are absolutely Congress's authority. And if Congress wants to pass a bill and say that states can collect taxes on internet sales, they can do it. So that's not in question. The constitutional argument goes out the window. The problems with these bills, at least from our perspective, and I think a lot of other free market folks have kind of stated this too, is one, they lack any taxpayer protections whatsoever. So it'd be automatically a tax hike in 24 states that have all signed an agreement together, and it'd be a pretty fast tax hike in the remaining states. The Departments of Revenue could do this by issuing a ruling, wouldn't have to pass through the legislature, 0 transparency for taxpayers. You wouldn't get any input. So there's a couple of concerns there with the federal efforts. I kind of want to state just a couple principled things that I think people should keep in mind when they think about this issue. And the first one is, like Andrew, I think, or Joe maybe said before, the Commerce Clause in the U.S. Constitution is not a loophole. It is not a tax loophole. It is the law of the land. It is the framework by which states have the authority to do what they're going to do. So when you hear the rhetoric that there's a tax loophole out there, just like how some people say that, a tax credit or a tax deduction is a tax loophole. It's not a tax loophole. It's the Constitution. And we shouldn't be throwing that word around in that context. And then the other kind of thing that I want to touch on that's I think kind of important is a lot of times when you read an op-ed from somebody or you come in here with talking points as to why it's important, they say that use tax laws are already on the books, right? Well, they conflate use tax and sales tax. Nobody's paying their use tax. We've already agreed on that. But what they say is sales taxes are going uncollected, and this is a way to collect sales taxes. Technically not accurate, right? Use taxes are going uncollected. Sales taxes are going collected just fine. They've managed to poke and prod retailers to become tax collectors for the state years ago. But the use tax collection question is a very important one. So if we're not talking about use taxes anymore, what we're talking about now is dissolving that physical presence standard for tax collection on the sales tax side. You're talking about dissolving the ability for the state, or basically letting the long arm of the tax collector reach across state borders. Now start thinking about, and I hate to be the guy who makes the slippery slope argument, but because these taxes already exist out there in some form and they've been constituted, they've been challenged in the past, I think it's important to note, think about what it means if a state can reach into another state and force a non-resident to collect taxes or to deal with their tax laws. If you go talk to the unions and to Center for Budget and Policy Priorities and all these lefty fiscal guys, they will not be shy about how much they want a state, for example, to be able to tax not just the profit of a company made in that state, but the profit of that company from all states combined in that state. That's a huge difference. There are states that already do this. Michigan, Ohio, for example, have taxes. They already reach across their borders in a constitutionally dubious manner. There are bills in Congress to try and strengthen that fiscal presence standard, but they don't go that far. But this deals with sales taxes, of course. But dissolving physical presence as a principle, I think, is a very concerning thing moving forward in the tax world. I think it means less ability for you to have states that can really guard their citizens from being subjected to taxes in other states. And I think it's a precedent that needs to be kept in mind as the whole debate goes forward. Now, if the federal bills pass, we've dissolved physical presence. But I think that's a very concerning thing that is a feature of the federal bills and a reason why we're not happy, with any effort there. And I think a lot of free market folks generally, in their gut, I go talk to staff on the Hill and they say, we've gotten, conversations about these bills and they talk about fairness and all this, and they're like, every single one of them. But there's just something in my gut that tells me that this is wrong for a reason. And it's that dissolving of physical presence and allowing states to do whatever they want to people in other states, that it's a tax hike. Those are the things that they hit them in the gut. So those are things on sort of precedent, I think, in principle, to keep in mind.
So Kelly sort of gave you an overview of what a lot of states are trying to do to figure out a way to get their hands on these revenue streams. And he mentioned some of the federal bills. Let me just sort of give you a quick snapshot of what these federal bills would do. There's the Main Street Fairness Act, the Marketplace Fairness Act. At their core, what these would do is essentially say that you're giving the Fed's blessing to states to force businesses to collect sales taxes on all of their transactions, whether people live in that state or not. And so what you're doing is sort of, as Kelly said, dissolving that physical presence standard, but maybe I would put it a different way, that you're basically dissolving the Commerce Clause protection that exists there to prevent states from doing dumb things to harm interstate commerce. You're basically carving out a little loophole for them and saying that the Interstate Commerce Clause is great for everything else, but on this, we'll waive it, we'll ignore it. And the bills take various different tacks to try to sort of soften that burden. Because you can imagine, for a company like Amazon, where they have a physical presence in a handful of states now, if one of these bills passed tomorrow and they were forced to collect sales taxes, what they would have to do is every time you purchase something from Amazon, Amazon would have to quiz you and say, okay, where do you live? And if you live in a certain county that has a different sales tax rate on shoes or clothing or whatever it might be, they'd have to figure out what the exact correct rate is. And we get into these incredibly complex definitional issues that Joe touched on when he spoke. Something like a granola bar. Is a granola bar food or is it candy? And that can yield two very different answers as to what your tax rate is. So anyway, there would be these huge potential complicated burdens, and so some of these bills try to sort of soften that blow by saying that we can deploy software solutions that will have essentially software that will know what the tax rate is, and if you just type in a zip code, well, they can figure it out. Maybe we can get into why those solutions are not quite fully formed. It's not quite as easy as it sounds there in doing that, but you can imagine what sort of a burden that would place on some of these businesses. And so what we've talked about, the brick and mortar retailers, the Walmarts of the world, what they've been doing is going out and saying, we need to level the playing field, because these online retailers, they have this loophole where they don't have to collect sales taxes. The loophole is known as the Constitution, that they don't have a physical presence in that state, and they don't have to collect. But anyway, that they have these loopholes, and we need to level the playing field. And that's frankly an instinct that a lot of libertarians and conservatives have, that we should have a level playing field, that we shouldn't have government granting certain benefits to one type of business over another. But the problem is that they're actually exactly flipping this on its head. Because what they're asking for is a very unlevel playing field. They're asking for Amazon and retail businesses to be forced to quiz you about what zip code you live in and charge you a different tax rate based on whatever item it is that you're purchasing there. Whereas if you walk into a Walmart, a lot of people do this cross-border shopping. Joe made the example of going over to Delaware. When he goes into Delaware, a Walmart in Delaware, let's say, and buys something, they don't quiz him about what his zip code is, about where he lives. Nobody asks him that. And the reason is that they operate on a system, it's called a sourcing rule. There's destination-based sourcing and origin-based sourcing, and basically what we're saying is, how do we tax something? Do we tax it based on where the business is located, or based on where the customer is located, where the item is actually going to be used? And so what these brick and mortar retailers are asking for is a system for online people that taxes people based on where the customer lives, which could be anywhere in the country and could potentially open up thousands of different taxing jurisdictions, while they operate on a system that taxes based on where their business is located, which is in one place that has one rate to figure out for the products that are in that business. And you can imagine how that could yield two very different issues of complexity. So we have sort of tried to talk about this origin-based sourcing issue, and it sounds like a boring sort of a technical change. Why does that matter? This is just sort of a bunch of people with nerdy, non-ironic glasses sitting somewhere trying to draft this stuff up. And but it's a lot more than that, because this is a way to sort of level the playing field in a real way. If we were to level the playing field and have this sort of a destination-based system, we would have Walmarts quizzing you about where you are actually going to use these items, which is not something, of course, that they're doing. But so what I want to do is, Joe, if you want to kind of run through some of the details of these federal bills, some of the potential pitfalls, if you will, and then we can talk about maybe how to fix it.
Tell stories about it, horror stories about states trying to collect this. Okay, do that. Well, the long-standing one that they've talked about for years and years and years is known as and these all have these wonderful Washington names, the Streamlined Sales Tax Bill and its accompanying, Streamlined Sales Tax Project and its accompanying federal bill, the Main Street Fairness Act. And that essentially allows all states to collect these use taxes from out-of-state companies. There's few requirements on the states, but generally it's just they can just do it. The more recent two proposals is the House version and the Senate version. I'm going to put them both under the header of the Marketplace Fairness Act. I think the other one has a slightly equity instead of fairness, and there's some differences between them, but it essentially requires that states do some level of simplification, have one place where everybody has to pay sales tax, one uniform base so that we don't have all these different rules, some notices that they have to give to rate changes, and providing software to people to be able to do this stuff. I mean, I like to think these are sort of basic things that states should be providing anyways, so if the way we get them is through a federal bill, all the better, but as Kelly laid out, this is, if we're going to abandon the physical presence system, we ought to extract some price for simplification out of it. But, you know, that's not something we want to give up without people knowing about it, because it is one of the cornerstones of our constitutional structure, the idea that state tax powers don't go beyond state borders, just as state services don't go beyond state borders. And once you unlatch taxes from state borders, what you're going to have is every state exporting their tax burden all over the place, and that's exactly why we held the Constitutional Convention in the first place, because that's what was happening. That was the problem. So, I can tell one fun story. I have to change the names because of attorney-client privilege, but let's say there's a gentleman that produces a popular fast food chain French fry, has a bunch of horrible additives in it, and he produces one of those additives, so it goes into this product. And he's based in one state, I forget what state it is, but this popular fast food chain is in all 50, so he's selling to people in all 50 states for this product. And he doesn't have any property employees in Washington state, Washington being one of these horrible states that's very aggressive about nexus rules. But one time he was visiting family in Seattle on a non-business trip, and he decided, you know what, one of my customers is here, I'm just going to stop by and say hey. So he did that. And then like a year later, his office got one of these horrible forms that states send out, which list, well, here's like 200 activities. Have you ever done any of these activities in our state? And you have to go through one by one and check yes or no. And one of them was, how many times have you visited a client in our state per year? And the secretary, which he delegated to fill out the form, which is something attorneys always tell you never to do, she said, well, he was there once last year, so once per year. And they mailed it back to the Washington Department of Revenue. So now, Washington sent him a notice and said, well, you have physical presence in the state, so you now have the term nexus with the state taxable connection with the state of Washington. So you now owe us, what is it, I think it's an 8% B&O tax on all of your sales in Washington state over the last 3 years and going forward. So here's a bill for like $300,000. And you know, we look forward to receiving your money there. And I'm a public interest lawyer in DC, so if I'm a little blasé about this, it's because I hear these stories over and over, and I've sort of lost the outrage. I just sort of, you know, I just sit down and do my best to try to help these people and resolve these issues in the public policy field. But if I got outraged about these things, I would never stop. So he of course is very outraged, and he has that attitude of the person who's had an injustice done to him, and believes that if he just reaches the right person and tells him the story, it'll be resolved, because that's how ridiculous it is. I think it is a ridiculous story. I don't think anybody would think that this is how the tax system should be operating, but it is how it's operating, and people want this to happen more. They want it to happen all over the country, to every business in the country, and it's harder to let that stand, because you know, back in the day where most commerce was local, if one state was going hog wild and trying to tax everything in the world, it didn't really affect a lot of stuff. But now, to sell in all 50 states, you just need a website. And you can just set it on autopilot. I mean, I don't know how many people here are selling something on a website right now, and potentially creating nexus issues. And it's not just for sales tax, it's corporate income tax, as Kelly mentioned, and also individual income tax. A lot of business travelers out there earning a salary as they're conducting business all over the country, and in a lot of those places, you're supposed to set up tax withholding before you show up in the state, even for a day. There's a lot of dumb rules out there, and I get a lot of horror stories, and you know, I think you're all brave for coming to the tax panel. It can be not the sexiest subject in the world, but it affects everything, and it's a big issue out there that's a big danger to liberty, and I hope you all keep aware of it. Back to you, Andy.
What I want to do before we get to Q&A is just sort of wrap up on one point, which is to say, what is it about origin-based sourcing that fixes this, and how does it fix this? So there's this legitimate issue where if you live in Arkansas, most people intuitively think that if you're buying a toaster in Arkansas at a Walmart, or buying it online from a retailer that sells online that exists in Walmart, that you ought to be paying the same tax rate. And so what origin-based sourcing does is basically says that wherever your physical business is located, you tax people, their purchases based on that single rate. So you only have to figure out one rate. You only have to remit taxes to one taxing authority, which is an important thing because if you have a dispute about how much there is, you don't want to have to travel to some other state to deal with some sort of a legal dispute. And it levels the playing field in the sense that every business that sells something to somebody is required to collect taxes, but only for the state in which they're located, not for thousands of different taxing jurisdictions. So you can see how it does a better job of leveling the playing field in a sort of pro-liberty way than what the other folks are suggesting. But here's the killer app of origin sourcing is that it would really promote tax competition, which everybody in this room would love. Now, there are a lot of state legislators who would hate it. A lot of folks in California would be very, very angry. But what you would do is you would create an incentive for every one of these businesses that operates online to locate in a jurisdiction that has low sales taxes or no sales taxes, because it would allow them to charge their customers low sales taxes or no sales taxes. So what we do is we establish incentives for businesses to locate in low tax jurisdictions, which obviously in turn will create incentives for states and localities to become lower tax jurisdictions to attract these businesses. So that's something that I think would be hugely beneficial for it. This is not really a silver bullet solution in any sense. Nobody comes out roses in this. The online folks would have to collect sales taxes in a way that they don't have to do in a lot of cases now. The brick and mortar folks wouldn't get to really screw over the online guys the way that they're trying to do now. Customers, you guys would have to pay sales taxes for these purchases that you make now, which in most cases you don't have sales taxes that are charged. And so that's why the sort of last thing that I'll say before we go over to Q&A is we've always sort of advocated that at a minimum we should be ensuring revenue neutrality here. Because if you now start taxing online retail sales in a way that you haven't done before, that's, depending on who you believe, it's either a little bit of money or it's a ton of money, somewhere in between, but it's a non-zero amount, we'll say that. You want to make sure that what you're doing is not just giving a huge new revenue source to spend for politicians, to spend on toys, which is what they would do if they've got a huge new revenue stream. So we think that you ought to ensure revenue neutrality, that if you bring on this new revenue stream, that you should lower the rates overall to make sure that we're not increasing net burdens on people, and that's a way to sort of ensure that we're keeping taxpayer protections in it too, that we're making sure that there's not more money coming out of your pockets than there were beforehand. So with that, we'll sort of turn it over to questions.